You are an auditor, and I used to be an auditor in my first career. People are scared of auditors. They want to do well with the audit tests and want to come out unscathed with a positive report. So they want to prepare for the audit. And to prepare for the audit, they obviously will get guidance as to what all needs to be covered, what all needs to be addressed, because the auditors will be looking for it. They will be testing compliance. So when that is in place, when that mechanism in place, I'm still wondering why the sloppiness, why the complacency. Does that imply that organizations that you have found to be non-compliant are not audited regularly? I'm just curious.
That is one factor. That is true. And one factor is the cost. They are not audited frequently as they should be. They do not have enough certification that are necessary for their business. And like you said earlier, they think that it's not going to happen to me. I think that we are safe. We'll take our chances. So that is one factor. Another factor that is very important is that people look at all audits the same way. People don't like financial audits. People don't like information security audits. So when I train my auditors, we talk about exchange of experiences, and we try to emphasize that it's the auditor's responsibility to shift the mindset of the client or shift the focus from hiding of possible vulnerabilities to exposing it. We tell them that you have spent a lot of money on setting up this management system and on this audit. Let's work together as collaborators to find what needs to be changed, to find what needs to be upgraded. And then the mindset becomes a collaborative mindset instead of a confrontational or adversarial mindset.
Welcome to the Cybersecurity Readiness Podcast series with Dr. Dave Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee is the author of the book Cybersecurity Readiness, a holistic and high-performance approach, a Sage publication. He has been studying cybersecurity for over a decade, authored and edited scholarly papers, delivered talks, conducted webinars and workshops, consulted with companies, and served on a cybersecurity SWAT team with chief information security officers. His work on proactive cybersecurity has been featured on USA Today. Dr. Chatterjee has been a tenured professor at the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. As a Duke University visiting scholar, Dr. Chatterjee teaches in the cybersecurity programs at the Pratt School of Engineering.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cybersecurity Readiness Podcast series. I'm your host, Dave Chatterjee. Today's conversation will center around cybersecurity certifications and compliance. In a world increasingly driven by AI systems, global regulations, interconnected supply chains, and escalating cyber threats, certifications is no longer just a checklist. It is a competitive weapon. That's why today's episode is titled Beyond Certification, Turning Compliance into Competitive Firepower. I'm thrilled and delighted to be joined by someone who has lived this reality across continents, industries, and crisis environments. Sandeep Pauddar, Global Program Manager for IT Audits and Cybersecurity at DQS, is that special guest. Sandeep, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm glad to be here.
So Sandeep, I always like my guests to share their professional highlights before we get deep into this discussion.
I'm happy to share. My name is Sandeep Pauddar. I work for DQS. I have 30 years of experience in starting with telecom and then gradually increasing my focus on information security. I'm a lead auditor for various standards, including 27,000 family of standards, automotive industry information security standards such as TISAX. And just this year, the latest standard that I established for DQS, and I have established it for all 60 DQS locations worldwide, is 42001 Artificial Intelligence Management System.
Amazing. In fact, Sandeep, when I was preparing for this podcast, I was just doing a review of the consequences of non-compliance. And I came across some very interesting but unfortunate anecdotes. For instance, a retail chain outsourced payment processing but never enforced PCI DSS compliance on its payment vendor. And as luck would have it, attackers infiltrated the vendor's point of sale systems and skimmed credit card data for months. Consequences? Banks demanded $14 million in card reissuance costs. A major card brand revoked processing privileges temporarily. The company was publicly listed as non-compliant. And that's just one example. Another one that got my attention was a cloud analytics firm serving federal agencies, and they decided to delay the FedRAMP authorization due to cost and internal friction. They were operating under pre-authorization, assuming they'd get approved eventually. During a penetration test, a federal agency found privilege escalation vulnerabilities that should have been remediated months earlier. Consequences? Immediate suspension from government networks, a $60 million contract cancelled, public notice of non-authorization. And I'm sure, Sandeep, as I turn it over to you, you'll have many more horror stories to share. But maybe, add to that, to those anecdotes.
I fully agree with you. Anybody who's hooked up to the news regarding cybersecurity sees this happen week after week for years. And the scale of it and magnitude is increasing enormously. So there are so many costs involved. And no matter which way you slice it, the certification process and preparation beats crisis recovery. So it's a proactive investment in resilience versus the high cost of breaches. A recent example here, where I live in Dallas, is that city of Dallas got ransomware attack and all of their systems were frozen for a while. FBI had to come in and recover. The cost was over $10 million. So they still don't have a certificate, even 2 years after having experienced that attack. So the mindset of leadership has not evolved in many sectors as the threats have evolved. With the introduction of artificial intelligence tools and more power to the bad actors, the threats are even wide-ranging and they have more abilities to identify weak and vulnerable organizations.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said about the leadership mindset hasn't evolved, which I find quite surprising. And I don't know if that's true for the relatively unregulated sectors, because where regulations are mandatory and the consequences are heavy, could result in the demise of the organization, I would be very surprised if the leadership looked the other way. However, my experiences being an advisor to many organizations has been that compliance is almost treated like, yes, this is a checklist that we need to take care of. Somehow let's do it so we can get the contract, or so we, come across as cyber ready. But what I found wanting is that drive, is that consistent or persistent focus to ensure that the organization is not only compliant, but compliant in a very substantive way. How would you react to that?
I fully agree with you. Of course, we see a little bit of a variance as we go from sector to sector. And it is very clear after analyzing various sectors, because we audit everybody, where the compliance is more pronounced and effective and where the mindset has not evolved like we talked about. For example, just drawing a contrast between automotive industry and state and local state governments. All of the OEMs got together a few years ago, just about a decade ago, and wrote an automotive information security standard called TISAX. It's based on 27001, and they are demanding that all of their supply chain show compliance by showing a label in that certificate, label for TISAX. So now we have seen tremendous growth, and as PDCA cycles grow annually, we have seen those industries improve quite a bit. While if you look at the FBI annual report, they analyze sector by sector which sectors are the weakest, and state and local governments in United States are the weakest on that chart, up to the point that Congress set up separate funding and which can be utilized through CISA website for state and local governments to bolster their information security. Surprisingly, those funds go unutilized every year. So that's the level of evolution of mindset that people don't think that it's going to happen to them.
Interesting. So there is definitely an element of complacency.
Yes.
But once again, I go back to the point I echoed a little earlier. If there is a legal requirement, the consequences of which are severe penalties, do you see that serving as an impetus for organizations not being complacent? In other words, where you notice this complacency, like you said, funds that have been allocated to properly adhere to compliance requirements go unutilized or underutilized. Are there no penalties involved for those organizations?
That's a very good point. So we see a little bit of difference in regulatory bodies and different governments around the world. I recently had a webinar where I presented the difference in how various governments are reacting to the evolution of AI and cybersecurity threats. EU has a risk-based, rights-driven approach. European Union has a risk-based, rights-driven approach. US has innovation-driven approach with a very light touch on regulations. And China has a state-controlled, security-driven approach. So different countries have different approach that are most suited to their governing style. However, another point that I want to make to answer your question is that even though there are so many regulations in European Union, we see often that they bring legal actions against global cybersecurity giants or global cloud providers such as Google, Apple, Microsoft, and win large sums of penalties. That means that the regulations were there and these organizations were aware of it, but they were still complacent in adopting those privacy standards or cybersecurity standards. In contrast, if there are business reasons to do it, people quickly acquire it. The same examples that I gave earlier, when automotive OEMs demanded that you can only do business with us if you show a TISAX label, then everybody jumped on board and got it done.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But like, surprisingly, the example that I just shared, when this particular retailer outsourced payment processing, but never enforced PCI DSS compliance on its payment vendor, that's an example that speaks to what you said earlier, the mindset that we will never experience a breach, especially when the breach comes through the systems of a vendor.
Certainly.
So I'm taking my chances. I'm taking risks and will deal with it if it were to happen. Now, again, trying to understand complacency, trying to understand the reactive behavior. I'll say this in their defense, not that I wish to defend that kind of reactive, complacent behavior, but there are so many certifications, standards, frameworks. It could be overwhelming for an organization to stay on top of it, isn't it?
That is very true. And it is a challenge for everybody to figure out. Many of the organizations do not have sufficient budgets to have a compliance group which can analyze all the requirements and figure out what would work best for them. So they just go with the minimum required for business.
Right.
And that's where the complacency begins about regulations. So that is an existing difficulty that everybody faces, from small to large organizations.
Absolutely. And just for the benefit of the listeners, many of whom may not be experts in this area, once again, sharing from my research findings, there is a wide array of cybersecurity certifications, standards, and compliance frameworks. Some industry specific, some regulatory, and others voluntary, but widely adopted. For instance, There are a variety of governance, risk, and compliance, popularly referred to as GRC standards, such as the ISO IEC 27001, 27002. Then there is the 27701 and more. NIST is there, of course, COBIT is there. And then if you go under the category of data protection and privacy certifications, we are talking about the GDPR EU General Data Protection Regulation. We're talking about USA's own HIPAA, FedRAMP, and more. The list goes on and on. In fact, we published a paper a few years back where our research found that one of the reasons why organizations were slow, sloppy, or non-compliant was because they were overwhelmed by all these frameworks, guidelines, regulatory requirements. And so they were essentially drowning in them. And that brings up my next question for you, Sandeep. You are an auditor, and I used to be an auditor in my first career. People are scared of auditors. They want to do well with the audit tests and want to come out unscathed with a positive report. So they want to prepare for the audit. And to prepare for the audit, they obviously will get guidance as to what all needs to be covered, what all needs to be addressed, because the auditors will be looking for it. They will be testing compliance. So when that is in place, when that mechanism is in place, I'm still wondering why the sloppiness, why the complacency. Does that imply that organizations that you have found to be non-compliant are not audited regularly? I'm just curious.
That is one factor. That is true. And one factor is the cost. They are not audited frequently as they should be. They do not have enough certification that are necessary for their business. And like you said earlier, that they think that it's not going to happen to me. I think that we are safe. We'll take our chances. So that is one factor. Another factor that is very important is that people look at all audits the same way. People don't like financial audits. People don't like information security audits. So when I train my auditors, we talk about exchange of experiences, and we try to emphasize that it's the auditor's responsibility to shift the mindset of the client, or shift the focus from hiding of possible vulnerabilities to exposing it. We tell them that you have spent a lot of money on setting up this management system and on this audit. Let's work together as collaborators to find what needs to be changed, to find what needs to be upgraded. And then the mindset becomes a collaborative mindset instead of a confrontational or adversarial mindset.
Spot on. And I can relate to it in ways that maybe you can't even imagine. Because when I started my career, after earning my chartered accountancy degree in India, I was placed in internal audit. And it was a very lonely experience because whenever I went into a unit to audit with my team, we were not very welcome. We wouldn't get the documents we wanted easily. It was really a struggle. And when we were going to finalize the report, that discussion wasn't very pleasant. But I was then in my early 20s, extremely naive, inexperienced, but idealistic. And I often wondered that why is this adversarial approach, as opposed to what you just said, a cooperative approach? Because an auditor is there to help the organization. Now, I can understand one can differentiate between internal and external auditors, but even then, I see audit to be a supportive function where the audit feedback could be extremely invaluable to organizations. So that leads me to infer or even recommend that the leadership should treat audit reports, especially the ones which comes with heavy criticism, let's assume relatively negative reports, welcome those and have the discussion on how to do better and make those adjustments. Because the worst scenario is when a company is accused of gross negligence by the victims of breaches and they have to defend themselves. If these organizations are able to produce reports, communications with the auditors that reflect the organization's genuine intent to address vulnerabilities as soon as possible, I think they would fare a lot better in front of the judge and the jury. Don't you think?
You said the right words and you pointed to the correct entity in an organization, the leadership. Leadership defines the cybersecurity culture and the communication. So if they frame the certifications as enabler of their business, enabler of innovation, not a burden, not a checklist that somebody has to unwillingly do, then the organization adopts it all the way through the levels. And it's very evident as when we go as cybersecurity auditors to organizations. Many organizations do not have sufficient understanding of why it is needed. But if leadership puts an effort and if they are involved in it through the policies, through continuous communication, then they set a good culture of information security throughout the organization.
Absolutely spot on. In fact, I wanted to remind the listeners, when I made the introduction to this episode, I said that today's episode is titled Beyond Certification, Turning Compliance into Competitive Firepower. So Sandeep is exactly right that organizations must look at being compliant, being audit ready, or passing audit with flying colors. Organizations must look at those capabilities as strategic capabilities that puts them ahead of their competitors, not only from the standpoint of winning contracts, but also from earning customer trust. And that is huge. That's how you gain customer loyalty. That's how you build market share. So I personally don't see why leadership wouldn't see a direct association between compliance effectiveness and strategic value creation. And the moment leadership sees it and does the communication, that's how you change the organizational mindset when they welcome auditors and say, okay, this is a great opportunity for an external entity to come in and review our work and identify what are the areas where we could do better. So essentially, they're helping us do our jobs better, keep the organization secure. So I really think that should be the mindset. Sandeep, my next question, and I have been passionately speaking about this. Once again, going back to my experience as an auditor, I was an external auditor. I've also been an internal auditor. But during my times, audit was primarily a year-end kind of an activity. And once the audit report was received, that served as a basis for review of the past, planning for the future. However, when I think about security audits, I'm thinking the audit should be real-time. There should be real-time feedback. So the organization is addressing the gaps and vulnerabilities before things go haywire. What is the current approach to security audit? Is it real-time or is it periodic and a little bit reactionary?
A combination of both. So I agree with you that there's a lot of reactionary force involved in here. And it takes time to evolve into a mindset which is more proactive about security. So proactive organizations have already set up their management systems and they already have a plan, do, check, act cycle to have their annual audits. They have identified which certifications they need based on their business needs, based on their client requirements, contracts, and based on the regulations that they need to be compliant with. So now these proactive organizations have already stepped ahead of the rest of their competitors. So they have the competitive advantage there. Reactive organizations, even though they may not have had an adverse event just yet, but they treat their compliance as a checklist. So once the non-conformities are found or the weaknesses or deviations from controls are found, then they reluctantly go to the checklist and try to somehow close the non-conformities without really meeting the intent of the controls where the non-conformities are found. So we see a wide spectrum of behavior across the industries, and auditors will have to make sure that they educate the client in making sure that correct steps are provided and a reactive approach is not useful for them, while a proactive approach through their PDCA cycles would be more beneficial.
Fabulous. Now, normally I ask my podcast guest to share some key takeaways from the discussion at the end. And we are a little ways away from the end. I think at this point, I would ask you, based on your immense experience, 30 years, wow, if you were to advise me, I'm say a CEO of a company, what are some best practices when it comes to compliance, when it comes to being audit ready or passing audit with flying colors? What are the 3 or 4 things that leadership should focus on?
That is such a good question, and thank you. I would say that leadership commitment is the topmost priority. Leadership must commit to certification not just as a checklist, but as a cornerstone of governance and trust. Top-level support from leadership gives a signal of accountability to regulators, customers, stakeholders, employees, and that builds a good culture of compliance within the organization. Next is preparedness, using audits and certifications as a continuous improvement exercise. There is no final step. There is no point in time where we say that we have secured everything. It's a continuous review and improvement process. So, proactively setting the standards to get ahead of regulations. Many organizations find that even though they had certifications, they fail to meet certain requirements, and then they are subject to penalties, legal consequences, lawsuits, reputation damage. And it takes a lot to recover from those. So that preparedness goes a long way in the success of an organization. Discipline is very important to enforce the certification standards consistently across global teams, to have a centralized dashboard or mechanism where from global inputs, the same level of expectation is managed. Measurement of this compliance through key performance metrics, and avoiding the just check the box and go through the one-time checks approach. So it's a continuous improvement process.
Very true. And I appreciate you making a concerted effort to apply my commitment, preparedness, and discipline framework to present your takeaways. That is extremely nice of you. Just to give the listeners a little bit of background about this framework is a cybersecurity governance approach, which is the intention of which is to change or to move the security mindset in the right direction so that an organization can create and sustain a high-performance information security culture. And I've applied this CPD lens, commitment, preparedness, and discipline lens, to understand different types of cybersecurity challenges, such as the one we are discussing today, which has to do with compliance and certifications. Obviously, Sandeep is the expert, and once again, it was very nice of him to apply the lens to showcase why commitment from the standpoint of the leadership is critical. That's how you build organization-wide support towards anything that is considered significant, in this particular case, to be truly compliant. And then preparedness is when you make sure that as you are checking the box from the standpoint of what controls need to be in place, where they are truly in place. I'm sure Sandeep can also relate to my experiences when I would find the documentation to be immaculate, but when I was testing some of them, I didn't find those controls in place. So I would assume it was not intentional, but it's very important that the organization does their due diligence, make sure what is being presented to the auditors for their review, for their assessment, is accurate, is current, and there has to be a constant review of these controls. And finally, discipline is about sustainability. Discipline is about institutionalizing processes, mechanisms, whereby you have a robust approach to ensuring compliance. in a substantive manner, as opposed to an ad hoc, chaotic approach. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not so great. We can't afford those kinds of fluctuations, especially if you, as an organization, want to be at a high level from a cybersecurity readiness standpoint. So, Sandeep, coming back to you, with AI being adopted in an extensive way, and as you know, and I have also found, regulations are always behind what the technological innovations demand. So they're always playing catch up in terms of, are the compliance requirements sufficient, or is there a lag there? And that's where, when you said something, and which struck home with me, that organizations shouldn't wait for the regulators to tell them what is important to be compliant about. They should do their own review, their own investigation, maybe involve the legal team, involve the auditing team, come together and decide or assess as to where the strengths are, where the vulnerabilities are, what needs to be done to address them. That is the proactive approach, where you're not waiting to be told what needs to be done to be compliant. You, in your own interest, you're doing it. And that is true proactiveness. So that's the mindset we are talking about here. Sandeep, your thoughts?
I fully agree with that. So, as we are auditing the new AIMS standard 42001, we realize that some of the organizations have complied to the controls that are written in 42001, but they do not have enough information security controls implemented. So, organizations have to proactively identify what combination of standards will work for them. A 27001 standard integrated with 42001 management system would be the best option for many of these organizations. And like you said, no regulator will come and tell them that you need these two standards. It's their proactive analysis that would lead them to understand that a combination of these two management systems would be very good for their organization.
Yeah, so true. In fact, as we are discussing this very important topic, another thought that comes to mind is, if I'm the CEO of an organization, I would put together a team that would provide oversight on compliance, on audit readiness, and I would urge them to meet with the auditors, meet with the legal team, and essentially engage in a discovery exercise. Find out what needs to be done to ensure that the AI systems that are in place, they are fully secure. And if not, how to make them fully secure, and also document the areas or the scenarios that's hard to secure. Because there's never going to be a perfect scenario where you have secured everything. But it is all about the intent backed by action, where the organizational leadership is coming together with experts such as the auditors, such as the legal folks, to make sure they have a well thought through cybersecurity strategy of preparedness, of discipline. And that's what's gonna help the organization not only be compliant, but be truly compliant. You'll often hear the word check the box. I like to use the example when it comes to cybersecurity awareness and training. There is a requirement that in certain industries, organizations require their employees to go through the training twice a year, where they will go to a certain portal, answer questions, watch videos, and then at the end of the assessment, sign off. This is done once or twice a year. Now, having participated in such training, while I commend that aspect of cybersecurity readiness, however, I believe that true awareness and training has to be contextualized, has to be customized, has to be focused on what individuals are doing in their respective roles, as opposed to creating a high level of generic awareness. You need that high level of generic awareness, but that has to be coupled with a deep dive in areas within which certain employees are working. So there is a generic aspect to it, and there's a specialized aspect to it. And that kind of contextualized awareness and training, I don't see often. So that's a classic case where a company can check the box if the question is as simple as, are you conducting cybersecurity awareness and training twice a year, let's say? So they check the box. But the deeper question is, are you really doing it well? Are you really doing it effectively? And that's the point I make, that yes, when you see those controls, when you see those questions, don't take the shortcut and say, well, what will it take to answer it in the affirmative? So one less hurdle. Rather, if that question triggers a deeper question relating to vulnerabilities, relating to gaps in security, what steps should we take to permanently close the gap? So there has to be a sincere and substantive approach to achieving compliance. That's kind of my final 2 cents. But I turn it back to you as we wrap up the episode, Sandeep, to share your final messages for the audience.
I really like what you said. Just like the FBI annual report says that more than 67% of the events are triggered by a good phishing email, somebody falling prey to a phishing email. So cybersecurity awareness goes a long way in preventing that. And when I audit clients and they show that, look, we have 100% compliance with awareness, all of the employees completed it. My next question is, can I see what type of training do you provide? Does it provide in-depth information to the clients and to the employees? So you're right about that. I would also like to quote a conversation I had with my son. He's a senior at UTD and he works for Department of Energy. And Department of Energy had a competition just this last weekend, day before yesterday, in Chicago, where they invited 100 teams from different colleges to participate in a contest where the red team had set up some infrastructure, and then all these teams from different colleges were finding the vulnerabilities. This type of effort is put by leading organizations, like this is a government organization, Department of Energy, but this type of time and effort put into finding good talent and raising the bar is very important across the board, whether it's a private industry or a government organization.
Thank you for sharing that. Exactly right. Once again, I echo the same sentiment that I think even your takeaways support. And that is, you have to ask the question why or how. And are we doing this right? Can we do this better? Basic questions. You don't have to be an expert. The intent has to be, I want to make sure our security practices are as robust as possible. And how do I accomplish it? Do I have the right expertise around me? And then you dive deep and you come back out and you'll find that you've covered a lot of ground, and it's a continuous process. You learn more, but there has to be a true intent as opposed to passing it on to a team, which is fine because you cannot do everything yourself, but the team must have oversight. This leadership should see compliance as a strategic capability that requires their undivided attention. So that's how I would end this episode, unless you have any final thoughts.
Just one more thought. I really, truly appreciate your time and giving me a chance to be here. Thought leaders like you are providing immense contribution to this industry and leading the effort on forward thinking.
Well, it's very kind of you, Sandeep. I would want to reciprocate by saying we need people like you to serve as, I don't like the word watchdogs, but you know what I mean. We need people trying to provide guidance, provide expertise, and help people, help organizations secure their data, secure their network, secure their people as best as they can. So thanks again for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
The information contained in this podcast is for general guidance only. The discussants assume no responsibility or liability for any errors or omissions in the content of this podcast. The information contained in this podcast is provided on an as-is basis with no guarantee of completeness, accuracy, usefulness, or timeliness. The opinions and recommendations expressed in this podcast are those of the discussants and not of any organization.